down when I asked the first five.
Hi.
Hello, nice
Lisa.
to meet you. Yeah, I think, like I said, I think that...
I like it. Hi, Jamie.
Hey, how's it going? If anyone wants to ask for
Where do you go?
they want to ask a question, they can. Maybe give them like 3 or 4 minutes.
This is an event,
To like go down the
a year, a month, and a day,
with every single
looking back on Occupy.
read all the questions.
This is sponsored by
Like Jeremy did it, like he just was like,
Platypus.
you know, we're going to start with questions. We asked the panelists to read things first. So
And we are just getting ready to start. We are starts at 7 o'clock, but we're given a few minutes for people to arrive.
go for it, yes. But you don't want us.
We are here at
You don't need to answer. Okay.
Yeah, you don't
That
need to
is-
answer.
Okay.
And I think that I would just highlight the fact that we'd like to see
Kimball Center
the main part of
at 60 Washington
So
Square,
we'd like to sort of get through this and
South,
have an open discussion.
which is New York
And I wrote down
University.
just what I was going to say
This is
about
room
Platypus,
9414.
and just like a few brief remarks that are actually shorter than what
And we
you're
have
gonna do,
panelists,
but they're just,
which we will go inside and see the panelists in just a moment.
Like, I'll give you a little, like, if I feel like things
This
are
is some of the people.
Okay, so I'll just I'll keep tabs on the time. Because I can also
yeah, I can do it as
From
well.
Platypus.
but
They have a
like,
platypus at the table, but they'll be inside in a few
Yeah.
minutes
Okay, so I will go.
when the
I'll
event
go in front.
officially starts.
See if
But I
or
have
no,
some
podcast
notes
will be.
written down, so
Lisa here is,
I'm pretty much all, I'll mention, and he's going to mention the event on the 14th.
Oh, I thought that
Yeah, I'm just kind of.
as I say, people are still arriving. They're still outside, and they'll be coming in just a moment.
Do we have a flyer for it? Can I?
Okay, why don't you just say it?
Okay. Yeah, because I would just read it off the.
Yeah, so if you want.
All right, we just entered the auditorium where the event is taking place here at New York University.
Oh, yeah.
These are some of the panelists. There's a couple more panelists who are, will arrive in a moment. I know some of the replacements are here already. You still have people arriving here. Some are still outside, and they'll be in a minute. This is Victoria Sobel. She's very active with Occupy,
For me, it's a big deal because, like,
especially with media. I've seen her in action.
Yeah, it's like what grocery roulette. It's like free or all. Like the whole thing. Like one or the other. Like you either get it or
I'm going to hand out a few more pieces of propaganda to the people who just arrived. You can see the videos from here. You can see the videos on there. Oh, cool. You can see the videos here. A little mist over here. Give it up propaganda. There you can see the videos.
I already had started. I read the book of a guy.
That's Brian.
You know? So I feel like, yeah.
Brian, here's the stand-in for
Hi. That's a nice program from the essay that I Yeah, we only have 3 minutes. We should get 2 more chairs, I think.
Yeah, I would rather be at the table here.
Jamie? You see the videos.
Thank you. I have a
There you are. His videos on that. There you are. Lovely. Here's Lisa.
Project before like the Arab Spring, a very large project about protest camps. Talk for a while. And then he's like, so what are you doing now?
This is the panel table.
Sad question to ask. But I was like, well, I'm trying to just finish up my undergrad and I just don't really know what's out for me, so I feel like I'd make more art outside of like school, but I'm not poli-sci or we are communications program, and now I feel like
Obviously. I was writing sort of so.
you seem really sure. So it's like if you're possible to want to give me a whole field talking for so like for people that have had the experience that we've had, that it's actually easier to get into. But just based on like specifically like this experience.
To occupy or something.
Yeah, and to not to wait for this. Not to wait until the application to tell people. Yeah. Or just like specifically the admission or something.
I mean, I'm also happy to read it, but if you want me to, the thing is, okay, am I online
There it is.
or not?
Getting the equipment ready.
I just have to line
I wasn't there.
I wasn't in the
Okay.
Yeah, I had no connection with that whatsoever, but still, you know.
But you know what, the undergrad programs and the graduate programs in school.
Lisa, you still have the...
A lot of times I feel like.
I have, it's okay.
And it's supposed to be, it's like a panel of professors that decides whether you get in, you know. It's not like the administration who like do the financing stuff and all that scary thing.
Exactly, they don't often get in the
I don't know, I shouldn't say that, I don't know.
Yo! You can see the videos there.
Yeah, I don't know. I would reach out to them.
Did I give you one of these?
Oh, I have.
I feel like he's like super, yeah, I don't know.
It's
I don't
not
know about it, but
Why? What did you really do? Really big?
he's like the chair of philosophy.
So it's not whatever. So that's all. It's all. Everything is contextual, and he might not view that as such a high.
He might think it's cool that I was involved in Occupy or something. You never know.
But it's not just that. I mean, you have all sorts of.
I'll just announce at the very beginning.
It's not like you're gonna do this.
I'm not even sure what I can send.
Right, yeah.
Lisa and Ross and Brian are with
Right, yeah.
Platypus. And these other people are panelists from
Yeah, I would look at it that way.
Occupy,
I think a lot of
for the most part.
like graduate programs are like pretty into it. So I've just been, I'm in an anthropology class now, and just like I'm writing the paper for that.
Okay,
class.
so I think we're going to just allow people to filter in as they come. I'm just going to announce an upcoming event and then hand it over to Lisa. On November 14th at the new school on the 6th floor of Eugene Lang, we're going to be holding an event on radical interpretations of the present crisis.
That's Ross.
We've got some really great speakers for
Platypus.
that. We've got David Harvey from CUNY. We've got Lauren Goldner, editor of Insurgent Notes. We've got Andrew Kleiman from Pace University, and Paul Maddock of the Brooklyn Rail. And I mean, roughly, the concept is that, you know, how is it that we have such sophisticated interpretations of the world without any reasonable prospect of changing it? How intelligible even is the world, you know, without our being able to intervene in it? So yeah, if you're free in the next month, it should be a really great event. So yeah, stay tuned. More will be appearing about it online. So, Lisa?
Thank you. I'm Lisa Montanarelli from the Platypus Affiliated Society. This panel is hosted by our student organization, established in December 2006. We have chapters in a number of cities, including New York, Chicago, Boston, London, Halifax, Toronto. We organize reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 1920s and 30s, the new left of the 1960s and 70s, and the post-political left of the 1980s and 90s for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. Since 2011, we've sponsored a series of panels and roundtables on Occupy in Boston, Chicago, Halifax, London, as well as New York City. You can watch recordings of all our Occupy-related events on our website. We also invite everyone to take home issues of our monthly publication, the Platypus Review, and to join us for weekly coffee breaks and a reading group. Here in New York City, we have branches at NYU, the New School, and Stony Brook. Our NYU chapter coffee breaks at 6 p.m. are on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Our New School coffee breaks at 5:30 on Thursdays, and we also have a reading group at the New School from 2 to 5 every Sunday. For the locations, please see our flyers or website at newyork.platypus1917.org. So without further ado, I'll go into a few brief remarks and then the questions for our panelists. The year 2011 witnessed popular uprisings erupting on almost every continent. In the first months, protests broke out in North Africa and the Middle East. By summer, they'd spread to Latin America, Asia, Europe, and even sub-Saharan Africa. And in September of last year, this wave of protests struck the US in the form of Occupy Wall Street, which quickly provoked thousands of sympathetic occupations around the nation and globe, from Occupy Oakland to Occupy Des Moines to Occupy Paris. Occupy tapped into popular rage to gather disparate ideologies under one tent. Some people called for class war, others for economic reforms, and still others for transformations beyond the bounds of economic conditions. These perspectives pointed to radically different directions for this movement. Yet slogans like "We are the 99% tended to suppress differences in favor of unity. We'd like to ask our panelists to consider what ideological tensions remain unresolved and keep reemerging. What might be the meaning of the present moment? What needs to be clarified? It also seems clear that Occupy has not yet achieved what it imagined possible in October of 2011. So why has Occupy, and in fact, why have all the movements of 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, the European Summer, and the American Fall, as well as more localized phenomena like the Quebec student strike, accomplished so much less than they expected? And what have you learned from this experience? What have we all learned from this experience? And finally, I'd like us to look at the present moment in light of possibilities left over from the past, the tasks we've inherited that we may have yet to fulfill. If our assumption here is if we don't think about our mistakes and missed opportunities, we risk repeating them without even knowing it. So how can we learn from the past so that we don't squander opportunities at the present moment? How can we maximize these opportunities? So without further ado, I'd like to get to the first question. And you can answer it, you don't have to answer every question, but just let me know which ones you would like to answer. I'll read the first one and then see which panelist would like to take that. What has changed between September 17th, when the moment began, May Day of the present year, and the one-year anniversary of S17, as far as these are significant dates in the history of the movement? What was different, or what has changed between working groups, individuals, and the constituency of the movement as a whole? Would you?
Well, I think that we can learn a lot by looking at what happened outside the movement during this time, as a reflection of what happened in it. Last fall, you had Troy Davis. I think that incited a lot of rage around the country. You had the threat of SOPA and PIPA a month later. You had Julian Assange and Bradley Manning coming to surface again, and they kind of acted as torch holders for what was happening. And so I think that Occupy was really able, during those first few months, to direct the forces around it in a way that made it very productive and maybe very influential. But it was able to claim this victory by occupying the attention of the mainstream media on a really national scale. But it started to fail when this strategy became a means to its survival. So I think that the difference between all of those dates really lies in Occupy's ability or inability to create this new narrative, and also when these practices failed to produce real victories, or victories that were as real as like handcuffs and concrete, then getting arrested and taking the streets became a lot less attractive. And yeah, and I think morale really suffered throughout last year, and also the police's ability to adapt to the movements of a large crowd and really neutralize the political energy that was there from the very beginning.
Okay, would anyone else like to answer the first question? Okay.
I think this one's on.
Yes. Okay, Fritz?
Before Occupy, New York and America in general had a very vibrant civil society. To relate this to Tahrir Square in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world, our dictatorships made it so that the only civil society that was possible were organized around mosques, which is why the big days of action were always on Fridays. So in Arab Spring, it more took on this dimension of what could we do that we could not do before, and they occupied squares and battled the police for it. And as a result, their government is very similar in many ways, but they now have possibilities for thriving civil society in Egypt. Here, there were a lot of things that we could do. We did have a thriving civil society. We even could stay in Zuccotti. We were allowed to stay in Zuccotti for as long as the company that owned it allowed us to. And when they said no more, then we were violently thrown out of Zuccotti. So I think right now what is obviously different is that there's no more occupation. And I don't really see much as having changed before and after, because we still have thriving civil society here, and we're allowed to meet in public like we're doing right now. One difference between now and while it was happening, though, is that at the time, having everybody there put forward this idea that we could all come together and get past our differences and actually work together to create a different world that would be nice to live in. However, I would like to say that what I saw at Zuccotti, it seemed that this square, people were less working together and more working side by side. And so the fact that they were next to each other gave off the illusion that people were actually working together, but the General Assembly was not a particularly effective thing. It was mostly the working groups who were doing all the stuff, and they were pretty not coordinated with one another.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add anything in response to this first question? Yeah.
Does this work here? Okay. I don't like the fact that we are trying to define our current moment as a moment of defeat. I think that if we're going to move forward from this moment in a positive direction, defining it in such a negative light from the get-go isn't going to be productive. And I think I go back in my head to August of 2011 during the planning of Occupy Wall Street up to September 17th. And I think about where we were then, and I think about the 30 years that came before that, what Occupy calls the 80s and 90s. And I think that in 1 year, I don't remember the term, in 1 year I think more was achieved in that than in those past 20 years. And I remember that before that time, I'm so glad that in the introduction we talked about the Arab Spring and Spain, and I don't remember what else was mentioned, but you know, the context the global context of things, because that was very much on people's minds. I remember before Occupy, there was a thing about going down to Wall Street and doing an action, and there were all these quotes from around the world saying like, "Where is New York? Spain, where is New York? Egypt?" And I think it's easy. I think people are prone, not because it has something to do with something called human nature, but just because of our cultural context, to not think back that far vividly. But I think if you do, you realize how much was accomplished by the Occupy movement.
Okay. Yes, please.
Okay. Does this work? Okay. A couple things. I want to say first off the bat that it's my understanding that what I think a lot of us thought was possible in the summer and fall of 2011, we far exceeded. And and I think beyond that, growing up in the movement before Occupy, we were kind of always in the shadow of Seattle in the 1999, and with this kind of understanding that the generation of organizers before us had all been in Seattle, and that had been this moment that had kind of impacted their soul, from that point on. And I think that one thing that Occupy has offered is that in a certain way it's kind of trained or inspired this generation of organizers. I think many of whom will be around for a long time, and that everything that they do is going to have the imprint of Zuccotti Park in it, or the spirit of Occupy in it. And I don't think that can be understated. I think that's a very important thing that's come out of this. But one other thing about what's changed since over the past year is that and initially, with the 99% slogan and all that, Occupy was this kind of ambiguous coalition of many different social forces. And I think in certain ways we're seeing the breakdown of that. And I think the most important or evident aspect of that is, do people know about the grand jury resistors in Seattle right now? So not so much. So right now in Seattle, the FBI is convened a grand jury to investigate anarchist involvement with the Occupy movement. It's ostensibly in relation to some kind of petty vandalism that happened on May Day in Seattle, but it was actually convened several months before May Day. And they've essentially been going around the Northwest, Olympia and Portland in particular, kicking in people's doors at 4 in the morning, arresting them, subpoenaing them, and then putting in a situation where at a grand jury you either testify with information about your friends that's going to result in putting them in prison, or you don't, and then you get put in prison, in this case for up to a year and a half. So there's 3 people that are right now being held, at least 2 of them are in solitary confinement, potentially until March of 2014, simply for their political beliefs. In the search warrants it listed having black clothing, anarchist literature, things of that nature. And it's really, I think, striking to me that all of these kind of institutional aspects of the left and kind of liberal groups that had spent the past year showing how down they were with Occupy Wall Street, and kind of I think have kind of profited a lot from the momentum it built, particularly major unions and nonprofit groups, but also Ben and Jerry's and Chris Hedges and whatever. I think it's really telling that not a single one of them has made a statement condemning this, when just on May Day, all of them marched in the street with us and were so enthusiastic about everything we were doing. And where are they now that we're getting our doors kicked in at 4 in the morning?
Thank you. Thank you. Victoria?
I usually try and talk without a microphone, so I think I get a little weirded out by the microphone. So if that's all right with everyone, I'll just try and project well. I resonate. For the recording. Okay, got it. So I do really resonate with everything that's been said before this, and I agree and disagree with some of the things that were said. Like Dave, I take myself back to August of 2011 and the meetings in preparation for the occupation of Wall Street, and what I thought that was. I immediately was reflecting on the call to action from Adbusters and the riots in London. I had really preconceived notions of what I thought it was, and that had to do a lot with the personal constructs that I had built up for myself as a student living in New York, attending an institution but still having student debt, and not feeling like this was, I guess everyone has referenced this idea of the moment, and myself not really understanding what that was. And for me, all of that was really shattered on September 17th, one, I came to the park and I didn't leave. I think what's interesting to note about September 17th, May Day, and September 17th of this year are kind of structural differences. It was mentioned in the question the kind of structural components like the working groups and individuals and how those things kind of undulated and changed between being exclusive and inclusive. And the truth is that there's been a world of difference. I mean, Occupy, as it stood in New York City in the park last year, was a small thing. Until the media blew it up, it was less than 300 people per night, and most of them were not from the city, to be honest. I felt like for a long time I was one of the only New Yorkers that stayed in the park. There were maybe like 10 to 20 others. And then once the mainstream media blackout had ended, there was this like this crazy resonance like all throughout the country and then actually all throughout the world. But I think that what's changed is that I guess it is kind of an awakening of young organizers that are really trying to figure out their grounding, trying to learn from existing organizers. And I do really agree with what you just said. I know the feeling of like having this like, I wasn't there. I couldn't go to I was too young to go to like Pirate Demonstration in Seattle or anything like that. I was like a middle schooler. So it was really not something that I could plug into. It was not something conceptually that I understood. And here for the first time was this forum, this open space where you could really get your hands in on something, you could say something, you could make something. I think between then and now things have become much more conceptual as far as demands and kind of things that we're aiming towards. I think everything has become more conceptual, and I think that that's something that's going to be highlighted in some of the upcoming questions. But I agree with Dave in that I think that there's more to look forward to, not necessarily under the Occupy brand.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. I'm glad that you brought up Seattle, 1999, because our next question is, would you characterize Occupy and its offshoots as anti-capitalist? Should they be? If so, what is the nature of these anti-capitalist politics? In which way do Occupy and its sequelae affirm or reject the political ideas of anti-capitalist movements before them? Just indicate if you'd like to answer that, please.
I'll answer it.
Okay.
Occupy wasn't anti-anything, and there was a lot of effort on the part of the movement to not take a negative stance towards anything. And I don't think that the movement as a whole was able to or even desired to articulate itself in those terms, though many individuals within it did. But for a long time, you know, the encampment's survival did depend largely on monetary donations. And but at the same time, Occupy recognized the injustices created by a capitalist class society, and at its best moments, I think really did I think that Occupy really did try and use the present condition as a means to justice, including money. And I think this was wise in that it avoided the kind of it avoided the pitfall of of identifying itself as anti-capitalist or any other kind of loaded political identity that would have given the mainstream media a lot to work with in terms of how the movement was seen. But at the same time, having this kind of like radical pluralist stance creates its own problems, and by not taking a position, by not specifically taking an anti-capitalist position, I think there's a danger, especially in the coming years, that this attempt to work with capitalism is going to turn into this kind of entrepreneurial solution to the growth crisis of capitalism while still affirming the systems of oppression.
Thank you, Victoria. Would someone else like to respond as well?
I don't know. I mean, I think if you look at Occupy Wall Street, we can just look at the name Occupy Wall Street and its target and what it was doing, and other things sort of fit under that umbrella. It definitely looked different and sounded different than maybe movements before it that called itself anti-capitalist, but I think it was definitely against financial capitalism and corporate capitalism. I think at least there was that in the air, while maybe it was more plural and open to people who didn't consider themselves those things. I think just by it being Occupy Wall Street, it was against financial capitalism. And whether that's against capitalism as an ideal or an idea, I think is a different question. If you read Marx, then he sort of believes that capitalism left to its own devices will become the current phase of capitalism we have now. Firms will get larger and larger and things will become more financialized. So does that make it anti-capitalist? I think that's like a sort of a different question. But I think it was able to grasp onto the part of the populace that always has this anti-capitalist zeitgeist, but doesn't really put it in those terms in a really large way, especially in the way that it brought class back into the conscious of people in this country, and so much as it wasn't in people around the world, maybe it put it back into their minds as well.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. Anyone else responding to question number 2 about the anti-capitalism, if Occupy can be characterized as anti-capitalist in its relation to previous anti-capitalist movements? Fritz.
Thank you. So I agree with Dave. I think that Occupy Wall Street was pretty blatantly anti-financial bourgeoisie, which is kind of the main group in charge of our country right now. And I think it was a coalition of a bunch of different groups that are against this, like the anarchists, socialist communists, progressive liberals, as well as Ron Paul liberals. And I think that the normal progressive liberal, very into unions and a sane capitalism. Ron Paul, kind of into an insane capitalism. Socialists and communists, kind of usually into state capitalism. I thought that actually the anarchists were the group who, more than anybody, were actually truly anti-capitalist in their ideas. But I think it's important to recognize that capitalism is not the only form of oppression, nor do I think it takes on, some sort of special nature that trumps all other forms of oppression. I think that racism, sexism, oppression of children, students, first, third world relations are just as important as capitalism and existed long before capitalism. So I would say that what I saw of the anarchists and how they organized during Occupy Wall Street, I thought it was not only oppressive in its own right, but I thought it was generally so inefficient that it kind of made capitalism and our modern society look pretty good and effective. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Okay, would you like to respond to the question?
Yeah. Again, being too young to have really been involved in like anti-capitalist movements of the past, I've only been able to kind of vicariously live through them via people that I now know and have been able to talk to about their experiences or video or theory that's come out of it. And so in some ways that's kind of a detached way of approaching it, but I think, the people that I met in August of last year largely did consider themselves anarchists and anti-capitalists. Whether they brought that to the table when they were organizing and when they were trying to outreach and when people were coming in from all parts of the country was not really at the forefront of that discussion. And so in that sense, I think that there were pretty heavy anti-capitalist undertones to what we were doing in the park to begin with, when we were really just marching on Wall Street twice a day, having meetings in between, and kind of just doing outreach from there, as opposed to what I understand kind of happened in Seattle, which was not initially anti-capitalist, but more kind of reformist, which became anti-capitalist as the movement grew. So in some ways, I think that it's kind of an opposite trajectory, where what might have started out more militantly anti-capitalist became a much broader kind of question of like broadest common denominator of like what can we agree to kind of come together on at this table, at this place right now in this moment, which was many things for many different people, and that's how the occupation of Zuccotti Park came to stop marching on Wall Street and start addressing all of these other problems, which is in this case kind of a for better or for worse situation. I would have liked to continue marching and maybe not become so distracted in certain other aspects of maybe maintaining the park, but what happened is what happened, and since that's the way that it happened, I think it's really interesting to note like the development of these groups, how they came to associate with one another, and my experience being in many of those groups was not that they were working next to each other, but was that they were working with each other very closely, and that the difference was that you had this inner working of a community located in like a space-based place, and then you had kind of this peripherally present audience that would attend things like the General Assembly or different sorts of actions, and so all of a sudden you had these kind of separate but the same entities. So there were just a lot of different things at play, but I to this day I think words like anarchist and words like anti-capitalist have this kind of pariah-esque thing when you say them out loud, so much so that I have trouble identifying myself as an anarchist, especially when I'm like within like certain institutions of people, just because I don't think that if you preface who you are by saying that, you kind of lose some things. So I think it's in terms of names, I don't know. I think it's a kind of a more complicated question of like self-identification versus like principle.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks. Do we want to, did you have anything to say about this particular question, or would you rather move on to the next one?
Yeah, real quick.
Okay, great.
So I think in the past several decades in the United States, there hasn't really been a large movement that's been explicitly anti-capitalist. I think there's largely been this dynamic, both in the altered globalization movement and in some of the other more recent movements like the immigrant movement and the anti-war movement, of kind of a nucleus of people that are anti-capitalist within a much broader movement that even the altered globalization movement at no point was dominantly anti-capitalist. It maybe was dominantly anti-neoliberal, but I think many of the factions that made up that were kind of like vague on where they stood on the kind of like very like structural issues. But I think one thing that's interesting about Occupy Wall Street is that the methods in which, like the ways in which it's organized itself, are these things that's inherited from this long-standing anarchist project of prefigurative politics. And so it kind of presents itself as this contradiction of like maybe subjectively not being explicitly anti-capitalist, but then organizing itself in a way that was in these methods that were built and intended to be experimenting with how we build structures and ways of life that go beyond capitalism. So I'm not sure if it's an either or thing. I think in some kind of like almost materialist ways, it was experimenting intentionally with like ways of being beyond capitalism, but I think it'd be incorrect to say that everyone that was involved with those experiments intended that to be what it was. I guess that's my answer.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll go on to the next question. What kinds of social transformation has Occupy brought about? Where has it triumphed and where has it fallen short? Additionally, why has Occupy failed to achieve what it imagined possible in October 2011, if you feel that that's the case? And also, what have you learned from the experience of either fulfilled or non-fulfilled expectations, or simply changed expectations and goals? What have you learned from this?
I think I can segue from that last question. Well, I think one of the actions like early on in the movement that did, I think, have a lot of political gravity was when there was the attempt of maybe about a dozen people to close their bank accounts. And this was during, this was like during larger marches, but the reaction of like 12 people closing their Citibank accounts was met with, it was taken very seriously. And while there was like a Move Your Money campaign floating around, I think that, you know, Occupy Wall Street did a lot in those early weeks to recognize the financial crisis of 2008 as a crime that somebody should be blamed for, as opposed to just blaming, oh, you know, the market failed. And I think if there had been a lot more effort and a lot more intensity to take responsibility for what bank you use, or if there had been a lot more behind supporting smaller banks or credit unions, then there might have been some kind of social transformation. But there was a lot of, you know, social transformation happens on a very small level, and I think that there was a huge separation in Occupy between ideology and practice. Like, for example, you know, we may be protesting large corporations, but we're still getting coffee every morning from McDonald's. Like, we still use the Bank of America ATM. And so I think a lot of it was just focus and intensity towards one issue that perhaps everybody shared or could have gotten behind.
Fritz, do you want to say something?
So, on the subject of has it created social change, fundamental social change, I think if you just go down the list, talk about different modes of oppression of the working class, women, race, third world, children, students, I think obviously all of these antagonisms in our society still exist a year later. I think that what Occupy Wall Street did that was triumphant was keeping alive this idea that people can all get together and go out in the hundreds and thousands and millions and just totally take shit over. I mean, this is like a pretty amazing idea dating back to Russian French revolutions. Even, you know, Jesus led a people's movement on Jerusalem to protest the European occupation. So this is like a very, very long tradition that has been kept alive partly by Occupy Wall Street, and I'm very glad that it happened. Where it failed, I think that it was not able to organize society in alternative ways. I know whenever I was at a meeting, I was dragging on and people would just be like, well, you know, it's a messy process, and it's heart-wrenching, and it can be boring. And the other day, I'm taking part in Brooklyn's, it's happening all over the city this year, but there's a participatory budgeting thing. It's a movement that started in Porto Alegre in Brazil 20 years ago, and over 1,000 cities in the world are doing it right now, where people get together, put forward ideas of what to do with the public's money, and then they vote. One person, one vote. Majority wins on what they're going to do. And I went to this meeting, and it was not messy. It was like really efficient. It was really quick. It was really fun. It was not boring. Just went, got stuff done in about an hour and a half, and then that was it. And I also want to say one more thing, is that this idea that Occupy has gotten so much done, I mean, we do have a vibrant civil society, and I think that this urban revolution puts forth the idea that civil society can take over instead of these little cliques that usually use traditional warfare methods to divide people. And we already have a vibrant civil society. There are groups that combat domestic violence every single day through legal means. There's just a documentary on PBS about the interrupters in Chicago who go and combat gang violence. It's just former gang members. They just keep their ears to the streets. And whenever they hear of someone going down, they just get in between it and don't let it happen. I mean, we have unions. We have a lot of stuff, and people are doing a whole lot. And part of the reason we have all the things we have are these people are doing these things. So I don't really think that, like, in the 90s, nothing happened, and then Occupy Wall Street happened, and now everything's happening. I actually, like, think that we have the rudimentary parts of a very different society, and we just need to get those groups in control instead of the state.
Just Dave, did you?
What new possibilities have opened up and what doesn't seem. I think that I again don't like that we're formulating it as if Occupy is something that happened and now we're in a moment that isn't Occupy. I think that's self-defeating. I think that when people talk about Occupy, we don't really talk about what, I remember in that summer we were talking about how we were going into one of the most militarized areas in the world, and there was a brutal state repression that helped break it up. I mean, I guess part of that is that you're looking at it, well, what techniques do we do, because that should be maybe expected or part of it. But I think that should always be kept in mind that, like, the failures of Occupy aren't necessarily a failure of the horizontal process or prefigurative anarchism or something. They're just parts of the nature of this kind of struggle where we are. I think right now, some of the things that I'm very happy about that have come out of Occupy partly is the Walmart strikes that are happening around the country. I think strike debt is amazing. I think these two things together have a lot of potential. I think the kind of coming back of a labor movement and reinterpreting the labor movement that my group's partly doing, but other groups are partly doing, it's happening around the country, along with the idea of striking debt and maybe newer ideas than organized labor, maybe all these other ideas that are coming out of Occupy. Where it falls short, I think you could list any kind of thing that it hasn't done and then say that's where it falls short. So I can only look at what it's done and not bring in every other form of, problem that exists in the world and say, well, Occupy hasn't done this, I don't have $5, So I think that's another thing. I think it was possible to go into the movement and go into one corner of it and decide this is what the movement was, this is what the process was, and get very disillusioned, think you found, these are the people who were in charge, and then you can go back the next day and go into another corner and you could get that exact same impression because of the kind of movement it was. So I think those are two of the concrete examples. Sotheby's is a labor struggle. That was one in New York. A lot of that energy came out of Occupy. In general, labor is winning now because of Occupy. And that's just the corner that I know about because I'm directly involved in it. Yeah.
I think I'll speak first, I guess, to personal transformations before I speak to the larger social transformations that I experienced or witnessed. I'll say that I did live in the park with the exception of 2 days. One was after I was arrested and one was, I don't even remember what it was, I just know there was another day that I wasn't there. And being within it and also being a part of the larger global movement. I worked a lot with the streaming group Global Revolution and being kind of acutely aware of what was really going on, not just in the park, but domestically and then internationally. I felt like I had a pretty good grip on things. Little did I know how kind of out of touch I was until the morning after the raid, and I had left the park because I wasn't arrested, but I was kind of walking aimlessly and I hadn't yet withdrawn from school, and I was like, it's already November. They've like, this is kind of crazy. So I walked to school and it was like 7 a.m. I waited until my administration kind of opened up and I was able to like talk to them. And then I remember having to meet someone in Midtown, and this was probably the first time in the two and a half months that I had like gone past 14th Street, and it was this crazy kind of culture shock moment where it was like the rest of the city is proceeding with their day as normal. They don't know or care precisely as to what just happened. I had this moment where I was kind of like, people must know I'm like an occupier, like this thing just happened to me, like, because I felt like I somehow was imbuing this like thing, and that was kind of this strange collapsing moment for me where I was able to see what had been going on, less than a mile away from us the whole time that we were at the park. And that was something that, being so far down in the corner of Manhattan, I didn't see. And by not being able to go back to Brooklyn, I think in the back of my head I did always know that the people that I knew and worked with before this movement that couldn't be at the park or couldn't be at every action were still doing the things that they were doing. And so that was kind of a really strange micro-macro look for me, because at the same time that I knew that that no one above 14th Street cared that the park had been raided, I also knew that over 100,000 people were watching the streams at that very moment. So it's this kind of moment where you really understand that people are going to do with their time what they feel is most important. And what I think that can say as far as social transformation on a larger scale is that there has been in many different ways different kind of this awakening moment that people talk about for certain people. Obviously not for everyone. That's not a blanket statement that can be issued about what Occupy has brought to the conversation, but it can be brought into the conversation as far as those people who were maybe half awake or wanting to have something broader to look into. I reflect really quickly now on Global Noise, if anyone took part in that. I was like on the 13th to 15th, and I knew a lot of people that organized that in other countries, and they're kind of reflecting on that kind of as a failure because there wasn't this giant outreach, and they're kind of figuring out what that means. And I asked my friend who organized it in Spain why he thought it was a failure. There was actually still tons of people that came out, and they just said, it didn't go quite the way they thought, but they're just going to keep going. And so as far as social transformation, I think people's willingness to continue going and not, like Dave said, not see the movement as being like opened on like September 17th of last year and kind of closed at this point is a broader way of looking at it, because there's no, I don't think it was that Occupy is done per se, or that and maybe we'll talk about this later, I've always seen Occupy as a tactic, not a movement. And when I talk about the movement, I don't know quite what I'm referring to, but I think that I'm talking about a broader global thing that's happening right now.
Okay, thank you.
So back in like 2006 to 2007, before he was this kind of like big movement celebrity, David Graeber was writing for this magazine called Rolling Thunder, which was put up at Crime Think. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that. But he put up this really beautiful essay called The Shock of Victory, where he essentially, and this was kind of like during this big malaise in the anti-war movement where we weren't really sure how to go forward and like things were really falling apart. And he kind of explained that lots of times, historically, direct action movements tend to accomplish their medium-term goals way faster than anyone, especially them, thought was possible. But because they accomplish their medium-term goals so quickly, they don't know how to move forward to accomplish their long-term goals, and because of that, they're seen as a failure. And he gives all these different examples of it. For instance, the Alter Globalization movement. A lot of people in the movement in the mid-90s and the late 90s, or in around 1999, thought that their goals of trying to bring down the Washington Consensus and open up space for different projects beyond neoliberalism would take a decade or two, if were even achievable at all. And by the time that that kind of cycle of struggles ended a couple years later, they'd actually accomplished much more than anyone had thought was possible in the span of just a couple years. And I think that if you look historically at the functions of direct action movements like that is something that's like seems to be true over and over again. For instance, during the anti-war movement, I was involved with a struggle in Olympia, Washington, called port militarization resistance, where we were trying to stop the use of our publicly owned port by the military to ship stuff to Iraq and Afghanistan. We thought this was going to be like a 5-year or like super long-term struggle, and within the course of a year, we had not only accomplished everything we thought was possible, but like much, much more. But in all of these examples, because they accomplished these like things they thought weren't possible, they don't know how to move forward to accomplish these even longer-term goals of like bringing down the state and capital. And I think with Occupy, if you think about what kind of the medium-term goals for Occupy were, in a certain sense, it was trying to transform the public discourse around the economy and around like kind of economic injustice, and also proliferating these models of prefigurative politics and like different ways of being in the world. And I feel like if you asked anyone in the middle of 2011 if those would be possible, like I didn't think it was. I thought it was so impossible that I didn't show up to Occupy Wall Street for a while, and I was very much like poo-pooing it. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves that like what I think a lot of people on the left thought was impossible, absolutely, was accomplished in the span of a couple months. And just because we haven't then moved on to like taking down capitalism in the state doesn't negate the really real things that were transformed. And just in like, I guess like really specific examples, like during the craziness of the fall and winter, like all of a sudden like my parents are posting articles by David Graeber on Facebook, and my aunt who works at this tech company in the middle of New Jersey, who like, I'm not sure they identifies as a leftist at all, is every week someone from her company is making runs to downtown Manhattan to deliver supplies. And I feel like in all these small ways that people that didn't even show up to the park, their life was transformed by the broader way that the political discourse was transformed. And I think we're not really going to see the long-term effects of that for like several years down the line, but I think a lot more has been accomplished than anyone really thought could have happened.
Okay, thank you very much. Because I want to leave lots of time for Q&A, I'm actually going to combine the last two questions. And I also have been noticing, I mean, very, very clearly, one of the things that keeps coming up is the possibility of, the anarchist project for prefigurative politics and sort of experimenting with ways of living that are somehow outside capitalism. And so, but also, some of the other panelists have expressed some doubts about whether it's possible to really be outside capitalism. For instance, we have the reference to buying coffee in the morning at McDonald's and things like that. So in perhaps answering these two remaining questions, if you could, I mean, if you want to, if you have a stance on it, maybe also address whether or not you see it possible to be outside politics in some way or create some kind of pocket within a capitalist society that is not specifically capitalist. I'll read the last two questions. How, if at all, has Occupy changed your political outlook? Has it modified the kinds of goals you hope to achieve through your activism? Has your approach toward organizing a mass movement in order to accomplish these goals shifted at all? And also, what new possibilities has Occupy opened up that beforehand seemed impossible? Conversely, is there anything that you once felt had been politically possible at Occupy's outset, but now no longer feel is possible? Open it up for your responses.
We have to change the film, but